Hello, everyone. I'm Reese.
And I'm Kelsey, and you're listening to episode 3 of our corrections. So to get started, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the corrections that I have from our episode 5, which was about the Greenland shark and some other things.
Yeah, I had a topic too, but...
Yeah. Can't remember what it was. Doesn't matter.
Thanks.
No, I can't remember my topic.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Your topic was riveting.
Yours was Parasites.
Yeah, that's right. It was a good topic.
It was really good.
Anyways, I have just a couple of corrections for this, and they're more discussions like usual. The first being the size of different sharks, because we talked about how Greenland sharks were really big, and then I also mentioned bull sharks and tiger sharks. Bull sharks are the smallest of the group. They average about 7.5 feet long and about 300 pounds. So that seems kind of big, but it's not huge by any means.
Compared to other sharks?
Right.
What would like a great white be?
That's not on our list today, so I don't know.
Oh, okay.
The second on our list is tiger sharks, who average about 10 to 14 feet, and they weigh about 1,200 pounds.
Okay.
So tiger sharks, the differences between male and female tiger sharks are pretty big. Female sharks are a lot larger than male sharks. So that's why the range is kind of large. But in general, 10 to 14 feet and about 1,200 pounds.
Okay.
That is a pretty big and scary animal.
Yes.
The biggest was that Greenland shark we talked about, which, to refresh everybody's memory, is about 21 feet on average. So twice the length. And about 2,200 pounds. So almost twice the average weight of a tiger shark.
Yikes.
And much, much larger. 3 times as long as a bull shark. And something like 8 times as much in mass.
Density.
Something like that. They weigh over 8 times more on average.
Wow.
Than a bull shark would.
That's a big animal.
As a big shark. Good thing they swim so slowly. I can outswim a Greenland shark.
Yeah.
But yeah, just a fun little, to start the corrections episode, a fun little check-in on how big some sharks are.
Good to know. I'll forget immediately, but you can remind me later too.
Sounds good. Our second correction from that episode is also our last correction. So go me, not needing to do an insane amount of corrections on my Parasite episode.
Yeah, good job. Our research is getting better, man. Well, your research is getting better.
Well, wait until episode 6.
Sure.
So the other thing I wanted to address was you had asked me how ectotherms, like the Greenland shark, survive in cold water. Because if you recall, Greenland sharks dive like 7,000 feet under the water, and they're in waters that are only about 40 degrees. So they're real close to freezing.
Yeah.
And as an ectotherm, sharks, or the Greenland shark in particular, does not produce its own heat. So humans are endotherms, which means our bodies produce the heat that we need. But Greenland sharks are ectotherms. So other ectotherms are things like snakes, where they have to go out and warm themselves up. So that's why you'll see snakes laying in the path of something really warm.
Just like sunbathing?
Right.
Cool. I didn't know that.
Right.
Don't frogs do that too?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Or turtles. I'm thinking of turtles where they're just like sunbathing on a rock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, generally, ectotherms are going to live in temperate environments, or they're going to migrate to temperate environments if they can, or they're going to hibernate. So frogs and turtles both hibernate, and their metabolic rates drop really, really low so that they don't need to worry about warming themselves when it gets really cold in the winter. Now, Greenland sharks do not hibernate. They don't travel to warmer waters. Instead, they use a high concentration, and they rely on sort of a dichotomy of a high concentration of urea and trimethylamine N oxide, which I'm going to call TMAO from here on out.
What? Say that again.
Trimethylamine N oxide.
No. Say the abbreviation.
TMAO.
TMAO?
TMAO. TMAO.
Easy enough.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned T-Mow in the first podcast. We talked about it a little bit. But it works, like I said, as a dichotomy. So really high amounts of urea in the tissues is damaging and can be poisonous to the sharks. So they have to have something to balance that out. And fish in general are going to have T-Mow in their tissues for various reasons. It works as a protein stabilizer. But in Greenland sharks, it works as a stabilizer with urea to stop their tissues from freezing.
Huh.
Right. It's a really unique way for them to keep themselves warm in those really cool waters.
That's super cool.
Yeah. Another fun fact, T-Mow devolves or denatures into a different type of compound, which I don't have memorized. But that compound is what causes fish to smell.
Really?
Yeah.
Like that smell comes from that compound breaking down?
Right.
Weird.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
Yeah, super cool. So my first correction from episode 5, it has to do with the northern stoplight loosejaw, which, if you remember, is the animal that lives in the deep sea with the crazy looking jaw that basically like unhinges, and it also can see it emits red light. It's one of the only or the only animal at those depths in the ocean that does that.
Neat.
Yeah, which is a huge deal. When we were talking about it, they have this adaptation on their eye that allows them to see red light at that depth, whereas the rest of the fish that cannot see that. And when I talked about it, I didn't really understand how that worked, and I was curious, so I wanted to go back and clarify it. But the way that it works is their eye has these photosensitizers around it that use bacterial chlorophyll, which I had never heard of, but it's a super cool thing. The big deal about this is it uses chlorophyll, and it's apparently, if not the only, one of the only animals to use that the way that it does.
Dang. Crazy
Yeah.
how nature does that.
I know. It's very specialized. What this does is it allows sensitivity to long wave red light. So normally animals wouldn't be able to see red light by the time that it dissipated to its long wave form. But because of this adaptation, the northern stoplight loosejaw can.
Wow.
Yeah, which is crazy. So it has these little red headlight things that it can see all these other animals with. And it can also see that red light because of that adaptation, which is nuts.
That's wild.
I know. My second one for episode 5 is we were talking about the institution that found the barrel eye fish.
Yeah.
And actually photographed it. And I wasn't sure what the name was, but it's Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI.
They do a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, well, I believe that because they found this thing, which is found and photographed this thing, which is the goofiest looking thing.
Dang. So we're on to episode 6 corrections now, and we'll pop back to me since I started episode 6, so it makes sense for me to start the corrections for this one. Now, most of these are just answers to questions that Reese asked, but some of them are pretty glaring mistakes that I made. We'll start with the first one.
Okay, the first one, the question that I asked you?
No, the first one's a mistake.
Oh.
I briefly said that the Brothers Grimm...
The who?
I briefly said that the Brothers Grimm released their book in the 1700s.
Okay.
But their first volume came out in 1812.
Oh.
And then they revised it 7 times from 1812 to 1857. And the anthology grew from about 156 stories to over 200 stories. And I think the anthology we have has 213 stories in it.
That's crazy.
Right. So
that,
it was like a lifelong thing for them.
Yeah, that's crazy. And so what was the range? What was their lifespan?
The revisions and additions occurred between 1812 and 1857.
Okay.
I don't know their lifespan. My second correction is about the Little Mermaid story, which if you are a fanatic of the original Little Mermaid story, you already know that I really messed that one up. First of all, it's Danish, not German, although it does have a very Germanic vibe to it.
Yeah. I mean, there are some shared traits there, I think.
Right.
Not that I would ever say that to either of them.
The other thing is that it was written by Hans Christian Andersen.
Really?
Which I knew, but when we did the podcast, just conveniently left my brain.
Sure.
I thought it'd be kind of fun to just briefly say the story.
Yeah.
I wrote out a little paragraph long summary of it, and I think it'd be cool to just read it out loud to you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let me hear it.
Cool. So Ariel was the youngest of 6 daughters, which I think is true in the movie too, and she was 15. And at 15, mermaids and mermen can go to the surface of the ocean and observe whatever's happening up there.
Yeah, like Rumspringa.
Right, just like Rumspringa. But because Ariel was the youngest, she heard all of these stories of her father and her grandmother and her sisters going up and seeing all these incredible things. And she started to get a little obsessed with it. So on her 15th birthday, she goes to the surface and she sees this beautiful prince celebrating his birthday on a ship and falls in love with him.
Sure.
Now, later, a storm sinks the prince's ship and she finds him floating along some rubble. And she rescues him. She picks him up and she brings him to the shoreline and she lays him on the shoreline and then scoots away and watches from a distance until somebody picks him up and takes him to safety. So she continues to then go to the surface and watch him like a creep and decides that she really loves him, truly loves him. So she starts to ask her grandmother all kinds of questions about humans, and she's strangely focused on how long they live, which seems like a weird question to ask, but whatever, you got a story to tell.
Yeah.
So her grandma tells her that they live much shorter lives than mermaids, but that they have an eternal soul. Believe it or not, Hans Christian Andersen was a very devout Christian.
Sure. So mermaids don't?
Mermaids do not have a soul,
Okay.
but humans do. So now she's obsessed with this idea of the eternal soul and of marrying this human prince and being with him for all eternity. So she sells her voice to the Sea Witch, which you see in the Disney movie,
Sure.
in exchange for real human legs. In the story, I said that they just cut her tail in 2 pieces and she had to walk on the mutilated remnants of her tail. And I don't know where I got that. I feel like it came from somewhere, but it's not from the original Hans Christian Andersen story.
Okay. It does. I mean, I didn't question it for a second because I was under the impression at the time that it was a German story, and that totally tracks.
Right. The German version, they just cut her tail in half.
Maybe that's where you got it.
Anyways, so it is real human legs, but it does feel like stabbing pains and as if she's walking on knives when she's using them.
Okay.
So she goes onto land, and the whole deal is if the prince marries her, she gets to keep her legs and she gets a human soul, an everlasting soul. If he marries someone else, on the day that he marries her, she will turn into sea foam. You can see where this is going. The prince loves Ariel, but only as a friend. So he decides to marry someone else, and on their wedding night, the mermaid sisters appear because they have sold all of their hair to the Sea Witch in exchange for a special knife, whereby if the Little Mermaid kills the prince with this knife, she can become a mermaid again and gets her voice back, gets her tail back, all those good things. However, she refuses to do it. She can't kill the love of her life.
Oh, my word.
So she dissolves into sea foam.
Sure.
Now, when she devolves into sea foam, the daughters of the air, who I think are in the foam, they're like spirits that live in the sea foam or spirits in the air that collect her.
Sure.
They appear to her and they explain that she can get an immortal soul like them if she performs good deeds. So she becomes one of them and she performs good deeds for hundreds of years until she can finally get a human soul. And that's the end of the story.
Do you think that partook in illicit substances?
No, I personally think that the story is an allegory for him and his life in a way.
Okay.
Because he was a very devout Christian, but he had a pretty tumultuous love life, and I don't think ever felt very successful in love.
Gotcha.
So I think that's why in the end she doesn't just like die and turn into sea foam. She gets this chance at an everlasting soul and happiness.
Okay.
Because Hans Christian Andersen didn't want to just die alone.
Interesting.
I mean,
analysis.
nobody does.
No, I wouldn't think so.
But yeah, that's the story of The Little Mermaid.
Weirdly, it's less crazy than the first version.
Than the one I told?
Yeah.
I should be a writer.
It's nice that it has a little more of a positive resolution.
Yeah. You get the semi-warm fuzzies at the end.
Yeah. It definitely makes more sense that they were able to turn it into a Disney movie rather than that I don't know where they would have even started with that first story.
With my weird version?
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. My last correction isn't even a correction. It was you asking me the historical context of Jonah in the whale.
Yeah.
This piqued my interest, so I looked into it.
Awesome.
So the historical idea of Jonah in the whale and the general consensus of biblical scholars is that the entire book of Jonah is ahistorical. It's allegory.
Okay.
And although the prophet Jonah lived in the 8th century BC in the Bible, the book of Jonah wasn't written until centuries later. And there have been fights about whether or not it was written down later and it had been passed down. But generally, the thought is that the Hebrew that was used in the book of Jonah shows Aramaic influences, which wouldn't have existed in the time of Jonah.
Interesting.
So it was absolutely written later, is the general consensus of biblical scholars.
That makes sense.
But they also describe in the story a lot of cultural practices that match with those of the Achaemenid Persians, which again is much later than that 8th century BC when Jonah would have lived. So because of the language that they use and because of the practices that are observed in the book, a lot of historians think that it was written after the fact.
Makes sense.
In addition to that, many scholars regard the book of Jonah as an intentional work of parody. They believe that it was a satire that was written down and then was later misunderstood by sages and included in the Bible. So let's talk a little bit about the elements of parody in this story. The views expressed by Jonah in the book are a parody of views held by members of Jewish society at the time that the book was written. So it was likely written by somebody who was not Jewish to mock Jewish society. And the primary target of the satire was likely a group who believed that God would destroy those who disobeyed him. Also that he would destroy sinful cities, that they would be completely obliterated, and that God's mercy didn't extend to those outside the faith. A lot of things that are still believed by highly religious people in both the Jewish and Christian faiths.
Yeah.
However, at the time, it was written as a parody about those of Jewish faith. Now, the book of Jonah also employs a lot of elements of literary absurdism, which I guess was seen a lot during this time.
Sure.
So things like sizes, not only of the fish, but of Nineveh, that's the city where Jonah was, right?
Yeah.
They're made to be these giant things that are highly exaggerated. It's illogical that there was a fish that large, that there was a city as large as Nineveh.
Really?
And that is a literary tool that was used in satire to create this world of absurdism.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, in addition to that, the motif of a protagonist being swallowed by a whale or a giant fish was a stock trope and became a stock trope almost immediately after this was written of current and then later satirical writings of the time. It was just a fun satire to put into these stories. And I think it was meant to be like this person, because Jonah was sort of apathetic and he sort of turned his back on things and he disregarded God. He is viewed as he's the protagonist. And then he goes into this big thing, this giant, unnatural thing, and has a change of heart. And what I was reading is that it suggests, in a satirical sense, it suggests some of the hypocrisy that they were seeing in the culture and some of the issues that they had with especially really wealthy people and kings and all of those fun people that nobody likes at any point in history.
The aristocracy.
Exactly.
The bourgeoisie.
That's right on.
Yeah.
The bourgeoisie.
That's right.
But yeah, I thought that was a really interesting thing, and I wanted to include it since you asked about it.
That is really interesting. It is just a crazy story.
And in my opinion, pretty clearly, at least an allegory, not meant to be
taken literally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a fun bit when I was researching it where I guess in the 18th century, a bunch of scholars and naturalists got together and debated whether or not somebody could survive inside the belly of a fish for 3 days.
Really? When did this happen?
18th century, I want to say. 17th or 18th. It was one of the two.
Sure.
But the thought of a bunch of old naturalists and scientists and biblical scholars getting together to fight about whether or not somebody could live inside a fish.
Yeah.
Hilarious in my mind. The answer is no.
Yeah, I would have loved to be there for that.
Just a fly on the wall.
That's fantastic. So my last few corrections for episode 6, I've actually got a few of them. First one is resonance frequency of the human body. You asked me what it was.
Yes, I did.
And I said, I don't think there's just one, which technically is true, but also there apparently is also one for the entire thing.
Dang.
Yeah.
Lay it on me.
There's some debate about this because it depends on the model that you're using, the experiment that was used to test the resonance of the entire body. There's a paper that I got this information in, and we'll link it on the website. But they say it's anywhere between 5 hertz and about 10 hertz, which, if you remember, roughly the same range that we got for the brown note.
Makes sense.
Right. So, which, yeah, totally makes sense. Apparently, it has more to do with, like, the aggregate of all the materials, like, in your body and everything. It's pretty complicated.
Does each individual person then have their own? Is that sort of the conclusion?
I don't know. Maybe. Probably, because I think some of it depends on, like, the size of the object and like, the amount of mass and
Makes
that
sense.
sort of thing. But, yeah, I think it varies a little bit, but there's kind of that range from approximately 5 to approximately 10 hertz. But that range had more to do with the model that they were using rather than the size of the person.
Okay.
Second one is similar, actually. You asked me if a building has just one resonance frequency or if it has multiples. And the answer is actually the same as the human body, yes and yes.
Cool. So theoretically, you could break down a building if you had the right resonance frequency.
Potentially, yes.
Right.
This is where you see buildings falling in, like, earthquakes. Part of it is, so the building resonance is the number of seconds for the building to naturally vibrate, which makes sense. It's like the number of seconds it takes for a building to sway back and forth.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And this includes the entire building, which is, again, like the human body, the aggregate of its materials. So it's not just one material, it's all of them together and how long it takes that to sway back and forth. There are a bunch of various factors that are included in this, like the resonance frequency of the ground. Different types of earth are going to have different flexibility and different resonance frequencies. The height of the building makes a huge difference, apparently, which also makes sense. And then the building materials. Like, everything going into it affects that.
Okay. That makes complete sense.
Yeah, right. Which it does make a ton of sense. But I didn't realize that there was also, they considered one resonance for the entire building. This is a major consideration when it comes to earthquakes. There are a few different models. Most commonly is known as the Boss model.
I love it.
I know. But it's a huge consideration, and there are a bunch of materials out there and videos and stuff, so definitely check that out. It's super cool. A couple name or person corrections, I guess I should say.
Being respectful, I love it.
Yeah, well, so...
Can I guess one of them?
Yeah.
Is it when you thought Mossbauer's first name was Felix?
Yeah. It's not Felix, by the way.
It's... Oh.
Do you remember?
It popped into my brain after we did the podcast.
Yeah.
It's not... Is it Rudolph?
It's Rudolph, but with an F, not a PH.
Oh.
So,
I like it.
Rudolph, good job. Lastly, and sadly, Vic Tandy. We looked it up, found a few different images of a person who was potentially him. No mustache, unfortunately.
But he easily could have one in the artist's rendition.
Again, please, if you would like to draw a picture of Vic Tandy with a mustache, it would be more than welcome on our site.
Not even more than welcome. 100% we will be using it. Appreciated, loved. All of those positive adjectives.
Absolutely. I feel like that would make a great t-shirt design or something.
We will put your design on a t-shirt and we will give you credit and some of the money.
Yeah. Or it should be like a fan. We should do one of those little fans and put it on there.
Love it. Well, that's all I have.
Yeah, same.
Cool.
Yeah, good. I hope this was a pretty quick one, honestly. Well, yeah, fairly quick.
Hopefully this means we're getting better.
I want to believe that. We'll see. We'll see how long our later ones are.
That's true. One more thing in announcement land. We will be coming to iTunes very soon. Mm-hmm. And again, check us out on social media. You can find us at CMF Podcast on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, SoundCloud. It's the best way to find us. CMF Podcast.
Yeah, CMF Podcast.
We don't want anybody to have to spell Charismatic Megafauna. It's hard enough to say.
Yeah, I don't know that I could spell it if you asked me to. I think probably the best way for people to find most of our resources is through our website.
That's true. We are at cmfpodcast.com.
Yep, super easy. It's got links to all of our different social media platforms. Definitely check it out.
Which actually reminds me, we are on the Wine and Wine podcast with Kylie and Emily. It's our first crossover.
Yeah.
And it's dropping tomorrow, Wednesday, April 17th?
17th, yeah.
That's the date. It's a great fun. They put on an amazing podcast, and they do a great job of keeping it really light and conversational in a way that Reese and I have not managed yet.
We do too much research, I think, is our problem.
And not enough at the same time.
I know, yeah.
We ride that line in the middle where we don't know enough, but we know too much.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. But check us out, because we're planning on having Kylie and Emily on our podcast as well to have a fun conversation. So you can find them. They're on Apple Podcasts. It's wine like the drink, and as in an ampersand, and then wine as in the activity. Because you drink wine, and then you wine, as they like to say. But you can also find them on Wine Podcast on Instagram. And they were really fun. So please listen to us.
Yeah.
Drink some wine. Drink too much wine.
Yeah, drink too much wine. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. As always, I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Reese.
And this is Charismatic Megafauna.